The recording begins with silence. Not the natural kind, but something heavy, something that feels as if the air itself is waiting. Then a voice breaks through. Calm at first. Measured. This is Father Elias Ward. The following broadcast is being transmitted with permission from the diocese for documentation purposes. There is a faint crackle, like old radio interference. And, for the sake of truth, what follows is one of the most unsettling audio recordings ever acknowledged by church officials. It was never meant for public release. According to internal records, it was archived, sealed, and nearly forgotten. But fragments of it resurfaced years later. And those who have heard it say the same thing. It does not sound like a ritual. It sounds like something listening back. According to church records dated October 14, 1996, the incident took place in a small rural parish located several miles outside a quiet farming community. The church itself was modest. Stone walls, aging wood, a bell tower that hadn't rung in years. The radio equipment was older still. It had originally been used for local broadcasts, Sunday sermons, announcements, occasional hymns. The signal range was limited, barely reaching the outskirts of the town. But on that night, the system was repurposed. Not for the public. For documentation. The subject was a woman named Clara Hayes, 32 years old. No history of mental illness. No criminal record. No prior involvement with the church beyond occasional attendance during childhood. Her case began, as many do, with small disturbances. Clara lived alone in a farmhouse inherited from her parents. Neighbors described her as quiet, reserved, but kind. She worked remotely, kept to herself, and rarely interacted with others unless necessary. The first report came from a neighbor who claimed Clara had been standing outside her house late at night. Not moving, just standing, facing the road. When approached, she did not respond. Only after several minutes did she slowly turn her head and walk back inside without a word. At the time, it was dismissed. Stress, fatigue, isolation. But within days, other reports followed. Lights turning on and off at odd hours. Unexplained sounds coming from inside the house, like furniture being dragged across the floor. And then the voice. One evening, a passing motorist claimed he heard someone speaking loudly from Clara's open window. The voice was not shouting, but it carried an intensity that made him stop his car. He listened. At first, he thought she was arguing with someone, but then he realized there was no second voice. Only Clara, speaking, as if responding to something unseen. Concern grew. A welfare check was conducted by local authorities. The report noted that Clara appeared disoriented, but physically unharmed. She insisted she was fine, that everything was under control. But the officer who filed the report added a detail that would later raise concern. He wrote that during the conversation, Clara would occasionally pause mid-sentence. As if listening, her expression would change subtly. Not confusion, recognition. And then she would respond in a lower voice. A voice that did not match her usual tone. Within a week, her condition worsened. She stopped answering calls. She stopped leaving the house. The final incident that prompted intervention came from her closest neighbor, an elderly woman named Margaret Ellis. Margaret claimed that one night, she heard Clara screaming. Not in fear, but in anger. The kind of anger that sounds controlled, deliberate, almost directed. Margaret approached the house despite her hesitation. She later stated that the front door was slightly open. Inside, the lights were off, but she could hear Clara clearly. Speaking. Not shouting anymore. Speaking calmly. Margaret stepped inside and called out her name. There was no response. She followed the voice down the hallway, each step heavier than the last. And then she saw her. Clara was standing in the center of the living room, facing the wall, her head slightly tilted, as if she were listening to something inches from her face. Margaret called her name again. Clara did not turn. Instead, she raised her hand slowly and pressed her palm flat against the wall. And then, in a voice that Margaret would later describe as not entirely human, Clara said, "You shouldn't have come." Margaret fled the house immediately. Authorities were contacted again. This time, Clara did not resist. She was taken for medical evaluation. The initial diagnosis suggested acute psychosis. Doctors noted her erratic speech patterns, moments of dissociation, and unusual vocal changes. But something did not align. During observation, Clara exhibited behaviors that could not be easily categorized. She refused to sleep, not out of agitation but insistence. She claimed that if she slept, it would get closer. When asked what she meant, she would only smile faintly and say, "It's already here." Over the next 48 hours, multiple staff members reported disturbances. Equipment malfunctioning without cause. Lights flickering in her room. One nurse claimed she heard Clara speaking in a language she did not recognize. Not loudly, whispering, constantly. When the nurse entered the room, Clara was alone, sitting upright on the bed, her lips moving, but no sound coming out. The attending physician, Dr. Howard Klein, documented a particular incident that shifted the direction of the case. During a routine evaluation, he asked Clara a simple question. "Do you know where you are?" Clara looked at him for several seconds before responding. "Yes." Her voice was calm, controlled. Then she leaned forward slightly and said, "But you don't." Dr. Klein later noted that the statement caused an immediate and unexplainable sense of unease. He ended the session early. By the third day, the hospital requested external consultation. Not from another medical facility, but from the church. This decision was not made lightly. According to official correspondence, the request was initiated after Clara demonstrated what was described as knowledge beyond reasonable explanation. She began referencing personal details about staff members, details she could not have known, names of family members, events from their past, specific dates. All delivered without hesitation, the church responded within hours. Father Elias Ward was assigned to the case. He was not the first choice, but he was the only one available on such short notice. His records describe him as experienced, though not widely known. He had handled several cases involving alleged possession, though none had been formally classified as such. Until this one. Father Ward arrived at the hospital late in the evening. He requested to observe Clara without interaction. The staff agreed. He stood behind the observation glass for nearly 20 minutes. Watching, Clara sat motionless on the bed, her eyes fixed on the door. She did not blink. Not once. Then, without warning, she spoke. Softly, but clearly enough to be heard through the glass. "He's here." Father Ward later confirmed that at that exact moment, he felt something change in the room. Not physically, but perceptibly, as if the space itself had shifted. He entered the room shortly after. Clara's gaze followed him as he approached. There was no fear in her expression, only recognition. He introduced himself. She smiled and said, "You took your time." The decision to proceed with a formal exorcism was made that same night. But there was one unusual addition. At Father Ward's request, the entire ritual would be recorded, not on video, on audio, using the church's radio system. The reason given was documentation. But in a private note, Father Ward wrote something else. He wrote, "If this is what I believe it to be, it will not remain contained." The equipment was set up inside the church. Clara was transferred under supervision, restrained, though she did not resist. The atmosphere in the building was described as unnaturally still. Even the staff present reported a sense of pressure, as if something unseen was pressing inward from all sides. The radio system was activated shortly before midnight. The signal was tested. Everything appeared normal. But one technician later claimed that during the final check, he heard something faint beneath the static. A second layer of sound, too distorted to identify. At exactly 12:07 a.m., the broadcast began. And for a moment, everything was quiet. The silence did not last. At first, there was only the low hum of the radio frequency, steady and mechanical. Then came the sound of movement, chairs shifting, fabric brushing against wood, the faint clink of metal restraints. Father Ward's voice returned, quieter now. "The subject is present. The rite will begin." There was a pause. Then another voice entered the recording. Clara. But it was not the voice described in earlier reports. This one was softer, almost gentle. You shouldn't do this here. No one responded immediately. Father Ward continued, reciting the opening prayer. His tone remained steady, but there was a slight tension beneath it now, something restrained. Clara let out a small breath. It almost sounded like a laugh. You think this place matters. The temperature in the room reportedly dropped at that moment. One of the attendants later claimed she could see her own breath, though it was not cold enough for that to be possible. Father Ward raised his voice slightly, continuing the rite. Clara's breathing changed. Slower, deeper. Then, abruptly, it stopped. For several seconds, there was nothing. No movement. No sound. And then, a voice. Not Clara's. Layered over her own, as if two voices were speaking through the same mouth at once. You brought witnesses. The radio crackled violently. A sharp burst of static cut through the audio, then settled into a distorted hum. The technician monitoring the system would later say the signal spiked beyond normal levels, as if something was pushing back through the transmission itself. Father Ward did not stop. He stepped closer. State your name. Clara's head tilted slowly to one side. The restraints creaked. And then she answered, not with a name, but with a question. Can they hear me? At that exact moment, several homes within range of the church radio reported sudden interference. Radios that had been turned off began emitting faint sound. Static at first, then fragments of voices. Not clear enough to understand, but unmistakably present. Inside the church, the air grew heavier. One of the assistants began to pray under her breath. Clara turned her head toward her. Too quickly, too precisely, and smiled. You shouldn't listen. The lights flickered. Once. Twice. Then stabilized. Father Ward placed his hand on the edge of the table, steadying himself. Leave her. Clara's expression changed. Not anger. Something colder. Something patient. She asked me to stay. That statement caused a brief pause. It was the first time the entity had implied consent. Father Ward's voice tightened. She did not understand what she was inviting. Clara leaned forward as far as the restraints allowed. You're wrong. The radio emitted a sudden, high-pitched tone, sharp enough to force several people in the room to cover their ears. And then, for just a second, the broadcast changed. Not in volume. In clarity. The distortion vanished completely. Every sound became unnaturally sharp. And Clara spoke one final sentence. Clear. Undisturbed. As if she were standing directly beside the listener. I'm not inside her. A violent crash followed. The recording shook as if the equipment itself had been struck. Shouting filled the room. Something heavy fell. The signal broke apart into chaotic bursts of static. Then, nothing. The broadcast ended abruptly at 12:19 a.m. No official explanation was ever released regarding what happened in those final moments. The church records state only that the ritual was interrupted. Clara Hayes was found unconscious on the floor. Alive. But unresponsive. She was transferred back to the hospital before sunrise. And within days, she began to recover. She spoke normally. She recognized people. She remembered nothing of the events inside the church. To this day, she maintains that the last thing she recalls is standing in her living room, touching the wall. The case was quietly closed. The recording was sealed. But years later, fragments of that broadcast resurfaced. Audio analysts who studied it reported something unusual. They found patterns beneath the static. Rhythmic. Intentional. Almost like a signal hidden within the noise. And in several isolated segments, when the distortion is stripped away completely, there is a second voice. Faint. Calm. Repeating the same sentence over and over. Not during the ritual. Not after. But underneath the entire recording. From beginning to end. Waiting to be heard.